I recently played through Deltarune for the first time, but I didn't play the game the way you would expect or want me to. I played Deltarune in the following order: Chapter 2 Weird Route, followed by Chapter 1, ending with Chapter 2 Normal Route. Why? Because I can! Now, I'm here to analyze my unique experience playing Deltarune out of order. And believe it or not, I might recommend you play through Deltarune the same way. This is Deltaruined. Before we begin, I assume that you're already familiar with Deltarune's first 2 chapters. Of course you don't have to be, but spoilers will be sprinkled throughout this video like revivements in the Dark World. Alright, here we go. Since I started my playthrough in Chapter 2, my first obstacle was deciphering what was happening. It was clear that our protagonist, Chris, is a high school student living in the shadow of their older brother, Azriel. Their class is naturally full of quirky characters, one of which I can't wait to discuss. Everything starts off simply, but then Susie wants Chris to go in the closet with her. This was when I realized what was really going on. I recognized a Chronicles of Narnia situation where the characters use a seemingly mundane doorway to travel to an exciting new reality. However, I wasn't expecting the super anime transition, or the outfits, or bold and brash. Here was the second major problem with playing the game out of order. I knew nothing about these characters, including their relationships and motivations. For example, I could tell the cast knew Lancer from Chapter 1, but I had no idea why Susie and Lancer were so close. However, Lancer gave me evil turned good vibes, and since they got along, I assumed Susie had a bad side too. Using context clues like this, I taught myself more about the characters throughout the Weird Route. The bedrooms in Ralsei's castle told me a lot about the characters' personalities. I mean, they were basically on display. It felt like Toby Fox included the bedrooms to remind players about the cast's personalities if they forgot after Chapter 1. I also want to mention that I enjoyed getting a sneak peek at Chapter 1's boss. At least I assume this big hamster thing was Chapter 1's boss. Anyway, I didn't know what Ralsei meant when he told us to seal the Dark Fountain, but it sounded like something epic we would do at the end of the chapter. Rewinding a little bit, I met Queen. I could tell she was a new Chapter 2 character because the cast didn't know her already. I loved Queen's scenes. From her introduction to the team-up scene to brawling her in Punch-Out. Queen's hilarious reoccurring appearances made me hopeful that Chapter 1's boss would also be a recurring gag, but we'll get to that later. Now, let's talk about my experience with the combat. The enemy bullet hell attacks were easy to understand. However, I was confused by everything else, including acting, magic, and the TP bar. Attacking was simple enough, and with some help from chat, I mastered magic and the TP bar. However, with a bit of experimenting, I would have figured it out myself. I prefer to learn game mechanics through experience because it's more organic, so it was fun to educate myself without a standard tutorial. I was impressed with Cyberworld's background art. It was like we were trapped inside a digital snow globe. Exploring Cyberworld made me ecstatic to see more gorgeous backgrounds in Chapter 1. Next is Sweet, Cap'n, and Cakes. I was not a fan of these characters because I don't like character squads in fiction. When characters always share the screen, their individual time in the spotlight is reduced. Therefore, you get less time to bond with each of them. As a result, I grew attached to these characters the least. Also, since they were Chapter 2's first boss, I was afraid that the game's other bosses would disappoint me as well. But fortunately, our next boss was Birdly. I was thrilled to see him in the Dark World because his confident, nerdy personality is A1. That being said, I started worrying that I missed his character arc in Chapter 1. Fortunately, I was wrong, but we'll get to that later. Alright, here we go. It's Weird Route time. Here is where I learned that my actions do indeed have consequences. Weird Route is already confusing enough, but holy cow, it gets worse if you play it before Normal Route. Nevertheless, I loved being clueless. It was like the game gave me a 1,000-piece puzzle. If I could put all the pieces together, I would learn the plot. However, I eventually acknowledged that this puzzle was too challenging. At that point, though, it was lovely to turn my brain off and roll with the story, especially after I've played so many story-heavy games. By the way, quick shout out to my Twitch chat for helping me meet the requirements for Weirdroot. I never could have frozen Birdly without chat's help. Now, you don't see Susie and Ralsei much on Weirdroot, and since I skipped Chapter 1, reuniting with them felt like running into somebody I forgot about, but they still remembered me. They were basically strangers who wouldn't stop following me. Speaking of strangers, let's talk about everyone's favorite stranger, Spamton G. Spamton. I had a feeling that Weirdroot's dumpster dude was Spamton, but the game never confirmed it until the end of the route. I predicted that Spamton would be the route's final boss because of context clues. He was a fantastic boss to conclude Weirdroot. I love that this was the first time I actually saw Spamton in game. You bet I was shocked when I saw his default sprite later on. I wondered how he conquered Queen's Mansion, but I assumed those answers would come in the normal route. But unfortunately, I never figured out how he got the Neo suit while I put my chicken nuggies in the freezer. So I probably missed a detail that someone will hopefully point out in the comments. Finally, let's talk about Hometown at the end of Weirdroot. First, I picked up on Noelle and Rudy's situation very quickly. The Chapter 2 hospital scene honestly gives you all the background you need. However, I was not expecting to see Sans straight chillin'. I couldn't wait to see him in Chapter 1 to learn more about his appearance. Besides Sans, I didn't feel like I missed any significant Hometown content by playing Chapter 2 first. It was all optional NPC dialogue that delivered quick jokes or character background. However, I didn't explore the entire town, so I might have missed something important. As you would expect, I had no idea what was happening at the end of Chapter 2. I just assumed Chris was wildin' or they were possessed. Of course, I later learned that was actually the opposite of what was happening. But let's ignore the implications of Chris's actions here and move on to Chapter 1. It's a fresh start from the actual beginning of the game. Thankfully, I played Chapter 2 first like a real Chad, so I already knew the story and the characters' relationships. However, I had no idea what was up with Susie. She is night and day between Chapters 1 and 2. Out of the entire cast, Susie clearly gets the most character development in Chapter 1. However, I'm glad I missed her Chapter 1 development. Seeing her Chapter 1 personality after her Chapter 2 personality made the difference much more jarring. I didn't expect Chris and Susie to be close in Chapter 1, but I was not expecting this. The game quickly confirmed that the story was what I expected. Chris and Susie accidentally unearth the Dark World in the school closet. Ralsei explains that they need to save the world, and then Susie breaks off and becomes a villain. Wait, what? I did not expect Susie to be away from the party for most of Chapter 1. I was disappointed that our party was disjointed for most of Chapter 1 because I was accustomed to a whole party during Chapter 2. In addition, I noticed that Chapter 1's comedy is weaker than Chapter 2's. For example, Chapter 1 keeps reusing the same joke that Susie and Lancer are doing evil things, but they aren't really doing anything terrible. I also recognize that Chapter 2's environments are much more fleshed out than the simple black settings of Chapter 1. However, skills improve with time, so I understand why Chapter 2 is more polished than Chapter 1 in so many regards. That also includes the game's antagonists. I was disappointed that King does not receive the same screen time as Queen. However, this might be a good thing because Queen is a stronger character than King. Speaking of antagonists, I felt a little hollow whenever I saw Lancer during Chapter 1. I knew he wouldn't play a significant role after the first chapter, so it was harder for me to care about him. Overall, I don't have much to say about Chapter 1. It's okay, but I quickly realized that Chapter 2 dominates it. I also didn't struggle with any fights because I had already played Chapter 2, except for Jevil. Before returning to Chapter 2, I took more time to explore Hometown. There weren't many things that stood out, except for the flowers in Asgore's flower shop and, of course, Sans' mom jokes. Of course, there was also the ending cutscene, which serves as the perfect segue into Chapter 2. I finally understood why Toriel asked Chris about her pie. I also had context for the dream dialogue about Chris's knife. For my second run through Chapter 2, I resolved to make all the good choices, including dialogue and sparing enemies. It was nice to return to the Susie I knew and loved, but I sped through the beginning of the game because I had already been there, done that. Once the routes diverged, the plot unfurled the way I expected. The party traversed towards Queen's mansion, and she kept annoying them along the way. Nevertheless, the cutscenes were funny, and it was relieving to read lighthearted dialogue after Weird Root's questionable vibes. Along the way, my prayers were answered. Birdly and Spamton finally received their character development. After playing through both Weird Root and Chapter 1 without many words from these two, it was alleviating to finally witness their character arcs. I also started to understand why Birdly Root, normal Root, is so much longer than the Weird Root. Between the Weird and Normal Roots, I'm glad I played Weird Root first. If I started with Normal Root, I would have missed out on cool features like Rules Card using our weapon creation from Chapter 1, and Susie eating chalk. By the way, I like how Lancer's sole purpose in the Normal Route is breaking the Fun Gang out of prison, then turning to stone. In addition, I would have been disappointed that King doesn't get a terrific boss fight like Queen does. However, Queen's battle was still slightly disappointing after beating the more challenging Spamton Neo's fight first. Based on final boss difficulty, it was clear that Toby Fox intended players to do the Weird Route after the Normal Route. Go figure. I was frustrated that Ralsei didn't explain the roaring to stop Queen like he did on the Weird Route. I understand that Chapter 2 wouldn't have a final boss if he did, however, after watching him defuse Queen with only a few words in Weird Route, logic dictated that he would do the same thing on the Normal Route. After sealing the Dark Fountain again, I skipped through most of the hometown stuff because I had already seen it. That is, except for Birdly being, alive. I anticipated different dialogue between Noelle and Rudy in the hospital because Noelle wasn't a murderer this time, and I was correct. However, I didn't know if the ending would be the same as the Weird Route ending. So I was a little disappointed to learn that it was the exact same, especially since our actions were so different during the Normal Route. But I guess this makes the story simpler considering Deltarune is slated to only have one ending. I won't lie, I was on the fence about playing Deltarune. I didn't think it would appeal to me, and I may have been right if I'd started with Chapter 1. But instead, Chapter 2's polish hooked me into Deltarune. I was driven by curiosity and my determination to solve the puzzle about what was happening in the game. Looking back, I wish the game directly answered more of my plot questions throughout the game. Unfortunately, I never did piece that entire puzzle together. I had questions about what was happening even after finishing the whole game. Google answered most of them, and I realized that the context clues are there if you think more about what's happening. Regardless, Deltarune isn't a very plot-heavy game. The main focus is the characters and their stories instead. I expected to see more of the Chapter 1 characters in Chapter 2, but they barely showed up. By the end of Chapter 2 Normal Route, I realized that the game structures the chapters so characters are limited to their respective chapters. That's why King doesn't appear in Chapter 2 much, and I imagine Queen won't show up much in the forthcoming chapters. In addition, Noelle and Birdly only received character development in Chapter 2, while Susie and Lancer took the spotlight in Chapter 1. Since character arcs are basically contained to one chapter per character, you could skip Chapter 1 like I did. Chapter 2 is more polished anyway. If you really want to save time, you could just play Chapter 2 and have a great time still. However, you will be disappointed if you play Chapter 1 second because the game quality certainly takes a dip. I'm glad Deltarune is episodic if it means the game's quality will take massive leaps like it did between Chapters 1 and 2. After jumping from Chapter 2 down to Chapter 1, I can tell that the 3-year wait for Chapter 2 was worth it. Now, if you've played Deltarune before, there's no point replaying the game this way. However, if you haven't played Deltarune and want a unique video game experience, go for it. Currently, it's the only game I know about that you can even play out of order, so this is your one shot. Some of the plot might confuse you, but you'll pick up quickly on what's happening. If there are specific storylines you want to experience without going through others, then definitely play the game out of order based on which characters interest you. You'll experience the same game anyway if you play the whole thing in the long run. If you just want that character development, I recommend following the path of Normal Route into Chapter 1 into Weird Route. But suppose you want to experience the game's most challenging gameplay above all else. In that case, I recommend Weird Route first, then Chapter 1, then Normal Route like I did. I suggest this path for players seeking a challenge because you get to fight Spamton Neo and Jevil the earliest this way, and you get to skip the tutorials. Playing the game out of order really is like completing a puzzle. You're given the story pieces and character arcs out of order, so now you need to piece them together. Finishing the entire game is like looking at the puzzle's box to see if you were right. And it is very satisfying to discover you were right about something. Therefore, I hope Deltarune lets you pick and choose the chapters when the game is fully released. I heard that Toby Fox plans to release the following 3 chapters simultaneously, so who knows? Maybe I'll run my little experiment once more when the time comes. Or perhaps you'll give it a shot yourself? Speaking of shots, if you're interested in witnessing my experience with another indie RPG, I'm going to recommend you watch my 3-episode one-shot series. It's a captivating RPG with a lot of lovable characters, and if that's what you like in your games, then my one-shot playthrough is right up your alley.